In this video, we will show you how to install your engine air intake gaskets. Let's get started. Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. The first thing that I need to mention is you're going to have to get underneath the front of the vehicle, so make sure you're in a safe location and in a way that you can get underneath it. Once you've done that, make your way into the passenger side of the vehicle. Right up front, underneath the glove box, you're going to find this little sticker. We're going to remove this trim panel. To remove the trim panel, you'll find two Phillips head screws holding it in place. Remove the pair. With that out of the way, you can find this gray connector. This goes to your fuel shutoff. Disconnect this, and then we're going to attempt to try to start the vehicle. It's going to crank, it might even start up, but then it's going to stall right out. Give it a quick check for corrosion and set that aside. Once you're sure you've evacuated the fuel pressure from inside the system, make your way back under the dash and reconnect this. Listen for a click, give that a tug to make sure it's secured. Continue on with your trim piece. Get that rubber seal back in place. Continue on with your two mounting screws. Open your fuel door and remove your fuel cap. Use some compressed air to clean any debris from along the top and front of your engine. Let's make our way over to the negative battery terminal. Loosen this 10mm headed nut just enough that you can remove the negative battery terminal from the battery. Set it aside so it's making no contact. The next thing we're going to do is make our way out here, right over to the mass airflow sensor, which is located on your air filter upper housing. Underneath this area, you're going to find a red locking tab. Use your finger or a hook and just kind of pull out that tab. That'll unlock it. Once you've done that, reach under with your index finger and give it a little squeeze right in the center. You're going to find a push tab. After it's off of there, every time you disconnect an electrical connector, just take a peek for corrosion, then set it aside. Now let's move along to removing our three locking clips that hold the upper box to the lower box. You'll find one in the front, one directly behind it, and then one towards the battery. Now let's follow that tube down to where it connects onto the throttle body. We're going to loosen this clamp just enough that we can slide the tube off of the throttle body. Use a flathead screwdriver or a 7mm socket. Set this aside. Let's remove the air filter and give it a quick inspection. If it needs to be replaced, now's the time to do it. Now let's move along the front of the engine. Along the intake, you're going to find the oil dipstick tube. Before you remove the oil dipstick tube, you're going to find that you have a wire connector that's attached to it. Just carefully press that off of the dipstick tube. Once you've done that, continue on with an 8mm and remove your one mounting bolt. Remove your oil dipstick. We'll give that a quick wipe. Now we can remove the oil dipstick tube from the oil pan, which is located all the way down along the bottom. Go ahead and grab onto this, give it a little wiggle, and lift it up and out. Inspect your lower gasket, replace it as necessary. Let's move into disconnecting each of our fuel injectors. For the fuel injectors, you're going to find on the passenger side, there's a squeeze tab. Squeeze it in, lift it up, give it a quick inspection, and set it aside. Now we need to make our way along the back side of the engine up to the firewall. Just underneath your windshield cowl, you're going to find that you have a fuel line that makes its way up to this little blue connector. For the connector, along the front and the back, there's a little lip that you can grab onto, gently pull it away, and lift up at the same time. This will be easiest if you grab both at the same time, pry them away, and lift it up. Once that's lifted up, go ahead and set that aside. Once you have the blue tab out of the way, you're going to find that you have a press tab right under here. To squeeze on this, you can either use your fingers or some skinny long nose pliers. We'll grab onto this, gently squeeze, and it should want to break free. Once it does, carefully pull this off to separate it. Now let's follow that line on top of the engine here. You're going to find a plastic clip that holds this in place. Let's lift this up and out of its position. Now we can continue on to removing the fuel rail from the top of the engine. Now we can start removing the fuel rail from the top of the engine. To do that, we'll use a 10mm. With the bolts out of there, we can continue on by wiggling around our fuel rail and trying to remove it. It's commonly going to be stuck inside of the engine because it does have O-rings holding it in place. While you wiggle it and pull it up, it's possible for the rail to pull off of the injectors. If that happens, fuel could come out. Just keep that in mind. Once you have the fuel rail lifted up, inspect the bottom of each of the injectors. Make sure the O-rings are still in place. Now we can remove this entire thing from the top of the engine. Set that aside. Remove your transmission dipstick. Wipe that off and set it aside. Let's remove this tube from the top of the intake. For this, looking at it, you'll find that you have a red connector here. For that connector, press down on it at the same time as you lift up on the tube itself. Set that aside. Disconnect your throttle body wiring. For this, you're going to use a pick. Come down and slide the red locking tab down and out of the way. Once it's unlocked, squeeze on the tab located on the front of the connector and remove the connector from the throttle body assembly. Quick inspection, set that aside. We're going to follow this tube down. You'll find an area that this connects onto the intake. For this, if you were to reach down along the bottom, you're going to find a squeeze tab. Squeeze that in and remove it from the intake. Now we can start removing some of the wiring harness from the top of the intake. You'll find that you have a connector along the top. As you follow it down, you'll find two more connectors making their way down. Remove all three. For this, we'll use a trim tool and gently separate it without damaging the intake. Let's get that last one all the way down there. Plenty of slack. Set that aside. Let's continue following that wiring down a little bit more, and you're going to find another area that clips into place on the intake. Pop it off of there. There we go. Make your way over towards the passenger side of the intake. For this wiring harness, you'll find that you have one area that connects it to the intake. We'll pry that off. If you were to follow this down in between here, you'll find that it leads all the way over to the side of the intake, close to the power steering pump. On that, you're going to find a gray connector. Release that connector. After you have that off of the intake, you should be able to disconnect it. To disconnect this, I'll use a pick. Get in between the connector, press on the tab, and I should be able to separate it. It's a little easier to get to this connector if you pull it off to the side over here. Once you've done that, looking where the tip of my pick is, you can find the squeeze tab. Carefully get in between that area with a pick or small prying device, gently try prying on it, and then separate it. If you can't reach your hands down there, you can also use some long nose pliers. Once it's disconnected, you can grab this wire and carefully pull it up and through. Set that aside. Let's move along to the other side of the intake. On this side, you're going to find the map sensor. Remove the electrical connector. To do this, press on the locking tab in the center here, and then gently slide it off of the sensor itself. Quick inspection. From underneath the vehicle, typically you're going to find that you have a couple different splash shields under the area. Ours are missing. Remove them as necessary. Next, let's make our way underneath the vehicle. Look for the oil filter. Right above the oil filter, on the driver's side, you're going to find the OP switch, or oil pressure switch. Disconnect the wiring for that. On this, you'll find one little squeeze tab, squeeze it in, and pull it off of there. Quick inspection, follow that wiring up. You'll find it's one mounting point that's on a stud. Slide it off of that stud. Once you have movement from that, continue on to your lower intake bolt. That's located right over here on the other side of the oil filter housing. To remove this bolt, we'll use a 10 millimeter. There's that. Now back up inside the engine compartment, we're going to remove the two bolts that hold the crash bracket to the top of the intake. Those are located right through this area. To remove these, use a 10 millimeter with the proper extension. Let's move along to removing our mounting bolts on the driver's side of the intake. On this side, you're going to find that you have 3 mounting bolts holding it in place. 2 of them are located up here, there's one right there, and one just below it. The third one's down underneath this area. It's a little bit harder to get to. I'll go for the hardest one first. Use my 10 millimeter still with the corresponding extensions. There's that one. Move along to this one. Make your way over to the passenger side of the intake. This mounting bolt is a little bit hard to get to. It's all the way in the far corner, very close to the power steering pump. Now it's time to remove our final bolt. That's the one that's going to be located through the center of the manifold here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can get to it with your 10mm socket and an extension. Grab that intake manifold, give it a little wiggle to separate it from your engine. With that pulled away from the engine, look down along the driver's side of the engine. You're going to find the EGR tube in this area. Use a 22 or 7/8 wrench to remove it from the engine block. Once you have that unscrewed, go ahead and give the EGR tube a little wiggle and remove it from the engine. To remove your PCV hose from the backside of the intake, we have it off of here so you can have a clear view. Looking at this, you can see that you have a squeeze tab on one side and on the other you have the same. You just want to go ahead and squeeze on both those tabs, it'll unlock, and then you can lift it up and off. Use your fingers or some pliers, whatever you can get in there with. Grab onto your intake system and lift it up and out of the vehicle. Let's continue by prepping the surface of the engine to put on the intake. To do this, generally you're going to want to have a sanding block so you can make a nice clean surface coming across the entire thing. Using a sanding block, you'll be sure not to create any divots where you might potentially get some sort of vacuum leak. Before you clean it, roll up some clean rags and slide them into each of the ports, making sure that you can still remove them in the end. Let's use our sanding block with some clean sandpaper. As we continue, let's make our way over here and clean this as well. Once you have it cleaned, go ahead and remove each of those 4 rags that you have in place. Continue on with some compressed air inside of each of these ports. Now with the intake on the bench, we can continue on by removing the throttle body from it. For this, you're going to find 4 8mm headed bolts holding it in place. Remove all 4. Remove your throttle body. With this separated, let's continue on by removing the gasket from the throttle body. Use a small pick or a screwdriver and gently pull this out of place. Here we are. The next thing that you want to do is clean up the surface of the throttle body where your gasket's going to go, and especially along the area that's going to go directly up against the intake. Use a flat blade razor. We'll hold this sideways and gently scrape everything off. You're going to see a whole bunch of carbon come off of this. Once you've done that, we'll continue on by making sure that we clean out the area where the gasket goes and along inside this area. There we are. That looks good enough. We'll set this aside. Continue on to cleaning and inspecting this area. You're going to find that the intake itself is made out of plastic, so be extremely careful when you clean it so you do not damage it in any way. Once you have that cleaned, let's continue on to putting on the gasket for the throttle body. Looking at the top of the throttle body gasket, you can see that it has the little alignment pin that protrudes outward. This area of the throttle body has a notch for it. Line it up, press it into position. Take that throttle body and line it up with your air intake. Start in each of your 4 mounting bolts and then snug them up. Once each of them are snug, torque them to 89 inch-pounds. At this point, we're ready to remove all 5 of our gaskets that go across the mating surface of the intake that goes up against the engine. We'll do the side over here, which is where the EGR port was. And then we can remove the rest of these as well. Clean and inspect the area. As you brush off any debris, make sure you're trying not to get it inside of the ports. Continue on with the installation. Your circular gasket goes in the area for the EGR port. As you're installing these, pay attention for the alignment tabs and line them up with their corresponding slots. Carefully bring this down into the proper position. Once you have it loosely in place, make your way back underneath the vehicle. The next thing you need to do is reconnect your PCV hose to the backside of the intake. Now from underneath the vehicle, it's time to start reconnecting that PCV hose to the backside of the intake. It's going to be extremely hard to see while I have my hands up there. Just grab onto that line and carefully press it into the backside of the intake. Listen for a click. Now you can carefully rest that back down onto the engine. Make your way back up top. It's time for your EGR tube. Make sure you clean up the threads on your fitting. Let's take this and put it in position. Carefully put it into the intake and then line up the threaded area with the engine. Start this in by hand and snug it up as much as possible. Once it's snug, you're going to want to tighten it. The torque for this is 41 foot-pounds. If you can't torque it, at least make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, so right there it bottomed out for me. Let's take it a little bit further. Give it a check to make sure that the tube is secured. Now we can start putting in our intake manifold bolts. You'll notice looking at them, you have 2 bolts that are longer than the other 6. The 2 bolts that are longer go inside the areas that have the bracket up along the top of the intake. Install one of your shorter bolts over by the throttle body. Now let's continue on by grabbing our 2 longer bolts. Those 2 longer bolts, like I said, are going to go where the bracket is. So let's take one of those and we'll put it in place down on the far side. Now that that one's started, I'll take my other longer bolt and I'll put it on this side of the bracket. At this point, all of our other bolts should be the same. The center one is pretty much the hardest to get to down here. Using your magnet, come down along the driver's side, put it in position in the intake, and then carefully put it in by hand. Get this corner one down here, all the way on the passenger side. We'll start that in by hand. Make your way all the way over to the driver's side. We'll get that last bolt down underneath the throttle body. Now that we have all of our upper mounting bolts started, we need to make our way back underneath the vehicle and put in that one last bolt. Get that last bolt in here. At this point, we'll continue on by bottoming out each of the mounting bolts. After you've done that, torque them to 159 inch-pounds. Now let's reconnect our OP switch. Slide that in position, listen for a click. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Continue on by resecuring the wiring harness to your starter stud. Let's move along to resecuring our wiring harness. We'll slide this into position along the bottom side of the intake there. Press it in. Let's make our way up here now. We'll clip this in all the way up to the top. Clip that in as well. Reconnect in your map sensor. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Let's get this back on here. Press it in, listen for a click. Connect this in. Now we can prepare to put on our oil dipstick. Carefully slide this from the top down towards the bottom and try to rest it down there. Now we can get underneath the vehicle. Let's grab this, we'll slide it into position. If you have any splash shields, you can put those up now. Let's make our way back up top and align that dipstick tube. We'll start in our 8mm headed mounting bolt and then snug it up. Once it's snug, torque it to 89 inch-pounds. Let's get our wiring clip on there. Reinstall your oil dipstick. Move along to reconnecting your knock sensor. I'm going to use my long grabbing tool to get access to this. Now that I'm holding onto it with my tool, I'll continue on with a pry bar and carefully come in between this area. What I want to do is put it along the back side of the electrical connector, so once I take the other side, I'll be able to press this in and it'll hold it still. Grab the other side of that connector and push it into position. Once you feel as though you have that plugged in, give it a tug to make sure they're secured together. Let's install our fuel rail. Slide this right through. Align all of your fuel injectors with their corresponding holes in the engine and press it down into place. There we are. Let's get this back on here. Continue on with each of your fuel rail mounting studs. Start these in by hand. We'll bottom them out and then torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Reconnect each of your fuel injectors. Let's get our fuel line reconnected. Press that in. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure that's secured in place. Once it is, continue on with your blue locking connector clip. Let's press this into place. Reinstall your transmission dipstick. Now we can continue on with our electrical connector. Once you have this pressed in and you hear a click, make sure you lock it in with your red locking tab. Give it a tug to make sure that's completely secured. Reinstall your air filter. Continue on with your air filter box. On the air filter box, you're going to find that you have several clips that are supposed to go into the bottom area of the box. So we'll slide that into position, and then we'll put on our hose as well. Tighten your clamp. Tighten your clamp using a 7mm socket. Make sure that's nice and tight so no dirty or unmetered air makes its way into the engine. After that's in place, continue on with your 3 locking clips. Time to reconnect the mass airflow sensor. Once again, you have a red locking tab. Press that in, listen for a click, lock it down. It's time to reconnect your negative battery terminal. We'll put that down onto the battery, press it down as far as you can, and then tighten up your 10mm mounting nut. Reinstall your fuel cap. Close the hatch. Okay, the next thing that you want to do is double check everything. Make sure all of the electrical connectors are connected in, and of course the fuel lines are connected properly. Once you've done that, go ahead and start up the vehicle. Let it run for a little while, come outside, and double check to make sure you don't see any leaks of any sort. Assuming there's no check engine light, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.